In this lesson, we are going to look at using samples and populations to collect data. To estimate the number of salmon in a river, biologists use a strategy called mark and recapture. At one place in the river, biologists capture some fish. Each fish is marked with a tag, then released into the river. At a different place in the river, biologists recapture fish. They track the numbers of marked and unmarked fish caught. They can then estimate the salmon population. Who would be interested in how many salmon are in the river and why? Possibly fishermen, so that they know where it might be a good spot to go to catch the salmon. Possibly conservation officers. Are we overpopulated or underpopulated with salmon? Are they becoming endangered? Why can't the biologist count all the salmon? Well, it's impossible to know that you've caught them all. And from observation, it would be difficult too, as salmon often swim in muddied waters. So it's just not possible to count them all. Why do you think they tag the fish? They do this so that they know which ones have already been caught. So that they tag them in the first spot, and then when they go down the river and they catch them again, if there's already a tag in them, they don't count them in their population. When collecting data, the population is the group about which you are getting information. A census is conducted when the data are collected from each member of the population. For example, suppose you test game consoles made in a factory for defects. Then all the game consoles made in the factory are the population. If you were to test each game console, then you have conducted a census. A census can be costly, time-consuming, and difficult or impossible to complete. So a census is only used when an issue is important or when the population is small. If a census is not feasible or necessary, then data are collected from a small portion or sample of the population. When the sample chosen is representative of the population, the data collection provides valid conclusions. For example, testing 100 game consoles out of 1,000 made each day is a sample. If those consoles tested represent the typical quality of consoles made in the factory, the conclusions of the data collection will be valid. Care must be taken when determining the appropriate size of the sample. If the sample is large, the data collection could be costly or time-consuming. But if the sample is small, then it may not be representative of the population. In each case, explain why a population was surveyed instead of a sample. So to determine the average number of siblings of his classmates, Carlos surveyed each person in the class. Well, in this case, the population is fairly small. It's the size of your class. Most classes might be between 20 and 30 students. So it wouldn't be very hard, it wouldn't be costly, and it wouldn't be time-consuming to actually ask each person in the class how many siblings they had. The second one, every 5 years, Statistics Canada conducts a census. One question in the survey is used to determine the ages of the people in each household. Now this type of a census takes time and it is costly. However, it is very important. Statistics Canada needs to know information about everyone who is living in Canada. So in that case, they only do it every 5 years because of the time and the cost to it. But it is important to have because that's how government promotes funding. That's how government determines populations and whatnot. So it is that important that they do have to ask the entire population. The student leadership team is planning a school dance. To attract grade 9 students to the dance, the team decides to collect data about the preferred music of the grade 9 students. The team set up in the hallway to collect the data. By the end of the day, it had surveyed 73% of the grade 9 students. Why do you think the data were collected from a sample instead of the entire population? Well, it would depend on how many grade 9s you have. But if we look at the grade 9s in our school, we're between 200 and 300 students. It would be really hard to get all 200 and 300 of those students on a day to answer your survey. Maybe there's students who are absent that day, they're away, so it would just be hard to get 100% of them. Will the opinion of the sample likely reflect those of the population? Well, we surveyed 73%, so that's pretty close to 3/4 of the students. So you are fairly likely that this sample will reflect the thoughts of the population. In each case, identify if data were collected from a sample or a population. Wherever a sample was used, explain if you think the conclusion would be valid. So a province considers banning cell phones in all of its schools. To determine the opinions of students on this issue, you poll each student in your school. Well, because it's the province that's considering banning the cell phones, the population would be all students in the province. So if you're only surveying those in your school, you are just collecting from a sample. Now, would this sample be valid? You might think so because you've actually surveyed all of the students. However, are we in a rural community? Are we in an urban community? Are we in a community where there is no cell phone service? There are still some communities in this province that do not have cell reception, and therefore those students won't have cell phones in the schools and probably really wouldn't care whether they were banned in the school. So you would really have to think about where you were located, and do the students in your school, are they a good representation of students in the entire province? Second one, to determine which politician is expected to win the municipal election, every person over 18 and who is eligible to vote in the election is polled. This would be the population, because the only people who can vote are those over 18, and then there are a few other restrictions, so they're only going to survey those who are over 18 and eligible to vote. So they are actually surveying the voting population. And the last one, to determine the average lifetime of a type of light bulb, 150 light bulbs were selected randomly from the production line and tested. Well, again, this would be a sample because they haven't tested all of them, and it would actually be impossible to test all of these, because if you're looking for how long a light bulb lasts, if you tested every one of them, you would not have any light bulbs left to sell, because determining how long they last, you have to leave them on until they die. So you can only do a sample. Now again, 150, well, it depends. 150 out of how many? If it's 150 out of 1,000, yeah, you probably hit a pretty good sample. But if it's 150 out of 1 million, you may not have found a good representation of your data.